The house stood at the end of a forgotten road, swallowed by gnarled trees and an atmosphere so heavy it pressed against my chest like unseen hands. Blackwood Manor, just saying the name felt like inviting something ancient to whisper back. The first thing that struck me as we arrived was how unnatural the air felt, thick with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds rolling in above us. The house loomed before us, its once grand facade now a skeletal frame of cracked wood and broken windows, as if it had been waiting, hungry, for someone foolish enough to enter. I should have felt excitement, the rush of adrenaline that always came before these viral challenges, but something about this place felt wrong. Not the kind of wrong that makes your hair stand on end for a second before you laugh it off, but the kind of wrong that sits in your gut like a swallowed stone, an instinct older than language whispering, leave. Now. The others were already setting up, their voices carrying through the stale evening air, pretending not to notice the way the trees seemed to lean toward us as if listening. Mark, ever the skeptic, cracked a joke about how this would be an easy payday. Jessica, eager to get her best angles, posed in front of the massive iron door, its rusted hinges groaning as if in protest when Chris pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been, and the scent of rot and something metallic clung to the walls like a living thing. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by our arrival, swirling in ghostly patterns under our flashlight beams. The floor creaked beneath our weight, the sound echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space, as though the house itself were breathing with us. A grand staircase, its banister clawed with deep gashes, led up into darkness, and somewhere beyond, an unseen door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the walls. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us playing it cool for the cameras, but I caught it in their eyes, the same creeping dread gnawing at my bones. We set up our sleeping bags in the main hall, placing our cameras strategically to capture every eerie moment, every shadow, every flicker of movement. But it wasn't until I stepped away from the group, drawn by the sensation of being watched, that I saw it, something shifting in the blackness beyond the staircase. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way shadows dance when you stare too long, but then it moved again, deliberate and slow. A shape, not quite human, standing just beyond the reach of our lanterns. My pulse thundered in my ears as I grabbed my camera, my fingers tightening around the cold plastic as I hit record. "Guys," I whispered, barely able to force my voice above the suffocating silence. "We're not alone." And then, just as Mark turned, laughing, just as the others rolled their eyes at my paranoia, the chandelier above us swayed violently, chains screeching, and the front door, the only exit, slammed shut on its own. The moment the front door slammed shut, the atmosphere in the house shifted, like the air had been sucked from the room, leaving behind something thick, something pressing, something alive. Every sound seemed louder, every breath felt heavier. The chandelier above us creaked on its rusted chain, swaying ever so slightly, even though there was no wind. Jessica let out a nervous laugh, brushing her blonde hair behind her ear as she adjusted the angle on her camera, but there was something in her eyes, something behind her forced smile, that told me she was feeling it too. Mark, always the skeptic, took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and grinned like an idiot. "Okay, that was good," he said, nodding toward the ceiling like he was speaking to some unseen stagehand. "Whoever's pulling the strings, nice touch. Very horror movie. Now, where are the hidden speakers?" His voice echoed back, unnaturally distorted, as if the house itself were repeating his words in a whisper just beneath the threshold of hearing. Chris turned to me, his face paler than I'd ever seen it. "Tell me you heard that," he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the grand staircase, where the shadows seemed to pool and stretch unnaturally. I didn't answer, because my brain was still trying to process what I had just seen through my camera's viewfinder. When the door slammed, I had instinctively lifted the camera, capturing the moment in real time. But when I hit playback, the footage showed something impossible. For a fraction of a second, before the door closed, there was someone standing behind it. Not one of us. Not someone from our group. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs too long, its head tilted slightly to the side as if watching us with curiosity. And then, gone. Just like that. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry as I handed the camera to Brandon. "Look at this," I whispered, my hands shaking slightly. But when he hit play, the footage stuttered and corrupted into static. The figure was gone. The hours crawled by, the tension in the house thickening with every passing minute. We made our way to the main hall, setting up a small camp with sleeping bags and lanterns, each of us pretending we weren't listening to the strange creaks and groans of the house settling, except, we all knew, houses don't settle like this. At exactly 3:13 a.m., a distant, rhythmic knocking started from inside the walls, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trapped just beyond the decaying plaster, drumming its nails against the wood in a slow, agonizing pattern. We all froze. One knock. Silence. Two knocks. Silence. 3. 4. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching for what felt like an eternity before Mark, ever the fearless idiot, smirked, raised his fist, and knocked back. 3 times. The moment his knuckles struck the wall, the house reacted. A gust of wind, cold, unnatural, the kind that carried the scent of rot and something long dead, rushed through the room, snuffing out our lanterns, plunging us into absolute darkness. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, a voice whispered. Low. Broken. Inhuman. And it spoke one word. Run. The moment the whisper echoed through the room, every muscle in my body screamed to run, but fear rooted me to the spot, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The others were frozen too, their faces half-lit by the dying embers of our lanterns, eyes wide, chests rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The house had spoken. The house knew we were here. And whatever it was that had answered Mark's knock wasn't finished with us. Then, without warning, the knocking returned, but this time, it wasn't a slow, eerie rhythm, it was furious, relentless, slamming from every direction at once, hammering against the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath us. Something inside those walls was trying to break free. The sound grew deafening, and just when I thought my eardrums would burst, it stopped. A silence followed, heavy and unnatural, stretching longer than any silence should. I exhaled shakily, my breath visible in the freezing air, and turned to Mark, who stood closest to the wall. His face was pale, beads of sweat trickling down his forehead, his fingers still resting against the wood where he had knocked. Mark? I whispered, but he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on something behind me, pupils blown wide, face contorted in an expression I had never seen before, pure, unfiltered terror. Before I could turn to see what had paralyzed him, the entire house seemed to groan, a low, guttural sound that rumbled through the walls like the exhale of something massive, something ancient, something waking up. And then, the lights exploded. Every flashlight, every camera, every single light source we had brought with us shattered at the same time, plunging us into total darkness. A scream tore through the silence, Jessica's. It was sharp, desperate, filled with a terror so raw that it made my blood run cold. I fumbled for my phone, shaking so hard I could barely keep hold of it, but before I could turn on the flashlight, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A scraping, wet and deliberate, like fingernails raking across wood, only deeper, slower, hungry. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs as my fingers found the power button. The moment my screen flickered to life, casting a faint blue glow around us, my stomach dropped. Mark was gone. Panic surged through the group, everyone speaking at once, voices overlapping in a chaotic blur of fear and denial. He was right there. Jessica cried, gripping my arms so tightly her nails dug into my skin. Chris turned in circles, shining his flashlight wildly into the darkness, his breath ragged. Mark. This isn't funny, man. Say something. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No sounds of struggle. Just emptiness. I turned my camera on, praying it had recorded something, anything, that could explain what had just happened, but when I played back the footage, my hands turned to ice. At exactly 4:06 a.m., Mark was standing against the wall. The knocking had stopped. Then, without warning, he stiffened, his back arching unnaturally, his fingers twitching. And then, he simply walked away. No hesitation. No acknowledgement of the rest of us. His body moved stiffly, unnaturally, his head tilted at an impossible angle as he disappeared into the shadows beyond the staircase. "Where did he go?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. I lifted my camera, scanning the darkness, my voice shaking as I murmured, "I don't think he left on his own." Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's silhouette disappearing into the darkness, his head tilting at that unnatural angle, his body moving like something was controlling it from the inside. The house had taken him. That was the only explanation that made sense. And yet, no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the thought of going after him, of stepping into that endless, suffocating blackness beyond the grand staircase, made my blood run ice cold. We weren't dealing with tricks or hidden passageways. We weren't dealing with some elaborate hoax. Something in this house was alive, and it had decided to play with us. The air in the house had changed. It wasn't just the silence or the way the shadows seemed to stretch when no one was looking, it was the way the walls felt like they were listening. I could almost hear them breathing, the slow, deliberate inhale and exhale of something massive just beneath the surface. And then, as if on cue, the sound began. A faint, rhythmic scratching. At first it was distant, so subtle I thought I was imagining it, like nails lightly dragging against wood, coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. But then it grew louder, more insistent, as though something trapped behind the plaster was trying to claw its way out. Jessica bolted upright, gripping my arms so tightly her nails dug into my skin. "You hear that, right?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Chris reached for his flashlight, but the beam flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The scratching wasn't coming from a single place anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The walls. The floor. The ceiling above our heads. Slow, deliberate, like fingers scraping from the other side. I forced myself to stand, swallowing against the rising panic in my throat. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. But as I took a step forward, the floor beneath me bulged. A soft, sickening ripple ran across the wooden planks, like something underneath had pressed against it before retreating. The breath hitched in my lungs as I yanked my foot back, barely able to process what I had just seen. And then the whispers started. Not loud. Not clear. But there, right against my ear, a hissing voice that did not belong to anyone in the room. A voice that rasped a single, garbled sentence I could barely understand. "They only take one per night." My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat, because as much as I wanted to believe my mind was playing tricks on me, I knew what it meant. We were waiting for sunrise. But so was something else. And it had already chosen the next one. Sleep never came. Even as dawn painted the windows with a dull, lifeless glow, the house remained thick with an unnatural stillness, like the calm before a storm. Mark was gone. His name clung to the air like the residue of a nightmare we couldn't wake from, but none of us dared to say it out loud anymore. Saying his name made it real. Saying his name meant admitting that he wasn't coming back. We sat in silence, huddled around the last working flashlight, our faces drawn, our skin clammy with sweat despite the icy chill that never left the walls. I kept my camera rolling, not for content anymore. This wasn't about the challenge now. This was about proof. Because when we got out of here, if we got out of here, someone needed to know what had happened. By noon, Chris decided he couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going upstairs," he announced, slinging his camera over his shoulder, trying to sound like his old, cocky self. Mark could still be here. The word sounded absurd the moment they left his lips, but none of us argued. We wanted to believe it. We wanted to believe that maybe Mark had just wandered off, maybe he was hiding somewhere in this rotting corpse of a house, waiting to jump out and scare the hell out of us. But I knew better. Jessica did too. Her hands were shaking as she wrapped her arms around herself, her lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. "Fine," I muttered, standing. "We'll check together." Chris nodded, looking relieved that he wouldn't have to go alone. But Jessica hesitated, glancing toward the mirror on the far wall, a tall, antique monstrosity with a tarnished gold frame, its surface warped and uneven. The light from our flashlight barely reflected in it, as if the glass was swallowing the glow instead of bouncing it back. "I don't like mirrors," she whispered, voice barely audible. "Not in this place." We ignored her and made our way upstairs, the floorboards groaning beneath our weight. The house was different now. The hallways felt too long, too narrow, as if stretching when we weren't looking. Doors that had been closed before were now slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of things that should not have been there, a rocking chair swaying slowly on its own, a portrait that seemed to have changed, the painted eyes now locked onto us. At the end of the hall, Chris stopped, his breath catching in his throat. "Guys," his voice was thin, strangled. I followed his gaze, my stomach turning to ice. The mirror from downstairs was here. Not a similar one. Not a copy. The exact same mirror. The same warped glass. The same tarnished frame. But we had just passed it. It had been downstairs. That was impossible. Chris lifted his camera, recording, his knuckles white as he gripped the device. The three of us stood there, staring, breathless. And then, the reflection moved. Not a trick of the light. Not a delayed response. It moved before we did. And in that reflection, standing just behind us, was Mark. Smiling. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The reflection of Mark stood behind us, his smile too wide, too sharp, his eyes hollow voids that swallowed the dim light in the hallway. But when I turned, when I forced my body to obey my screaming brain, there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty hallway stretching behind us, suffocating in its silence. And yet, his reflection remained in the mirror, grinning at us like a predator watching its prey. Chris staggered back, nearly dropping his camera, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "This isn't real," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head like he could force reality to change by denying it. Jessica clutched my arm, her fingers ice-cold, her nails digging into my skin hard enough to hurt. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could only stare, my stomach twisting into knots as Mark's head slowly tilted to the side, his lips parting as if he were whispering something. But there was no sound. Then, without warning, the walls groaned. A deep, guttural sound, like wooden ribs bending under unseen pressure, like something massive shifting beneath the house, stretching, awakening. The mirror shuddered violently, the surface rippling like disturbed water, and Mark's reflection stepped forward. Not out of the glass, but deeper into it, as if being pulled into some vast, infinite abyss that stretched far beyond the frame. His body twisted unnaturally, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, his mouth widening into a silent scream that sent a shock of nausea through my gut. And then, in a blink, he was gone. The mirror cracked down the center, the fracture splitting the glass like a jagged wound, and the reflection staring back at us was once again our own. But we weren't the same. We weren't just scared anymore. We were trapped. We ran. We didn't speak. We didn't stop. We flew down the stairs, tripping over each other, desperate to put as much distance between us and whatever the hell was happening on that second floor. But the house wouldn't let us go so easily. As we sprinted through the corridors, the very architecture shifted around us, doors appearing where they hadn't been before, hallways stretching into impossible distances. The walls breathed, the very wallpaper bulging outward as if something was pressing against it from the inside, something waiting, something hungry. And then, from behind us, a noise. A low, rasping breath. A presence looming, watching, closing in. Chris turned, his flashlight flickering, and what he saw made him scream. Not a yell. Not a cry. A raw, unfiltered, soul-wrenching scream of absolute terror. Because standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light, was another version of himself. Same clothes. Same face. Same wide, terrified eyes. But the double's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. And then it whispered, in Chris's own voice, "You don't belong here." Chris's scream didn't stop. It tore through the air, sharp and jagged, as if his very soul was being ripped apart by the sight of his own doppelganger smiling back at him from the shadows. Jessica grabbed his arm, yanking him backward, her own breath coming in ragged gasps. My own body refused to move, paralyzed by the impossible reality in front of me. Chris was staring at himself. Not a reflection. Not a trick of the light. Another Chris. Standing perfectly still in the dim corridor, its face eerily serene, its lips curling upward in that grotesque, knowing smirk. Its voice had been his. Identical. But dead inside. There was nothing behind those eyes, no life, no soul, just an abyss wearing his skin like a borrowed mask. And then, it stepped forward. The real Chris stumbled backward so fast he nearly fell, his eyes wide, his hands trembling violently. "What the hell is that?" he gasped, his voice barely audible over the hammering of my own heartbeat. The doppelganger's expression didn't change, it just kept walking, slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And then it spoke again, in a voice so identical to Chris's that for a split second my brain refused to accept that it wasn't him. "You don't belong here." Its head tilted slightly, almost playfully, like it was enjoying our reaction. Then, with a sickening crack, its jaw unhinged, stretching impossibly wide, exposing rows of needle-like teeth glistening in the dim light. A low, rattling noise escaped its throat, something between a laugh and a growl, a sound that made my skin crawl. Jessica screamed. Chris turned and ran, his breath coming in frantic gasps, and I didn't hesitate, I grabbed Jessica's wrist and sprinted after him. But the house was shifting around us, its hallways stretching, twisting, doors slamming shut as we passed them. The walls bulged outward like something was pressing from the other side, shadows bleeding into the dim candlelight that flickered from unseen sources. I could hear something breathing, something massive, something hungry, its exhale rattling through the wooden beams like the house itself was alive. We turned a corner, only to find ourselves staring at a door we had never seen before. It was old, covered in deep claw marks, the wood splintered and blackened at the edges. A single word was carved into it, etched deep into the rotting surface. Down. A noise echoed behind us, a wet, dragging sound, like something crawling across the floor, pulling itself toward us. I turned just in time to see it, the doppelganger wasn't alone anymore. Behind it, in the flickering candlelight, more figures were emerging from the darkness. Their limbs jerked unnaturally, their heads lolling to the side, their grins identical, wide, stretching, too sharp, too wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. Us. There was another version of Jessica. Another version of me. Their bodies twisted, twitching, waiting. And then, all at once, they lunged. We had no choice. We ran through the door. We ran down. And as the door slammed shut behind us, I realized something chilling. We weren't running away. We were running deeper into whatever nightmare this house had planned for us. The staircase spiraled downward into a suffocating blackness, the air growing thicker with every step, heavy with the scent of rotting wood and something else, something damp, something old, something that had been waiting. The door slammed shut behind us, sealing us in, and for a moment, the only sound was our own ragged breathing, echoing unnaturally in the narrow, decaying corridor. My flashlight flickered, the beam trembling as I scanned the space ahead. The walls were wrong, not stone, not wood, but something that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The texture pulsed, almost like skin, stretching in places, splitting in others to reveal glimpses of something moving just beneath the surface. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a basement. This was something else. Chris was whispering frantically, his hands gripping his head, rocking slightly, muttering, "This isn't real, over and over again, like a mantra that could force sanity back into his mind. Jessica clutched my wrist, her grip so tight I could feel her pulse hammering against my skin. We needed to move, but the air felt thick, like wading through water, like something unseen was pressing against us from all sides, waiting for us to collapse under its weight. I swallowed my fear and took the first step forward, dragging them with me. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. The house above us, if it even was a house anymore, had stopped breathing. The shifting of the walls, the whispers, the scratching from inside the wood, all of it had gone silent. And somehow, that was worse. Then, the whisper came. Low, broken, inhuman. Not from behind us. Not ahead. But inside us. A voice that did not belong to any of us, whispering our names in a sing-song rhythm, stretching them out, savoring them. The flashlight flickered again, and for a second, a single heartbeat, I saw something standing at the end of the corridor. Not a person. Not a shadow. Something that was only half-formed, its body warping in and out of existence, like it was still learning how to wear this world. And then, it lunged. The darkness shattered. The walls screamed. The ground split open beneath us, and suddenly, we were falling, spiraling into the endless black void below. And just before the light from my flickering flashlight disappeared completely, I saw them, our reflections. Waiting for us at the bottom. Smiling. Arms wide open. I hit the ground hard, the impact forcing the air from my lungs. For a moment, everything was a blur of pain and suffocating darkness, the weight of the fall leaving me stunned, my mind struggling to catch up with reality. But then I heard it, the wet sound of something moving nearby, dragging itself across the cold floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I forced myself up, my palms scraping against the uneven surface beneath me. The flashlight had slipped from my grasp in the fall, its beam flickering weakly where it lay a few feet away, casting jittering shadows along the walls, shadows that twisted and moved even when nothing else did. Jessica groaned somewhere behind me, her body shifting, trying to pull itself together. Chris wasn't making any noise. That terrified me more than anything. I reached for my flashlight, fingers trembling as I grabbed it and pointed the beam toward the sound. The moment the light cut through the darkness, my stomach twisted into a cold, jagged knot. The floor wasn't made of stone or wood, it was something else entirely. Something soft, pulsing, shifting beneath my fingertips like muscle and tendon stretched too thin. I gagged, yanking my hand back, but that wasn't what made the scream catch in my throat. It was the figures standing at the far end of the cavernous space. They were us. Not like before, not twisted, smiling reflections in a mirror, not grotesque doppelgangers wearing dead grins. This time, they were perfect. They stood completely still, their expressions blank, their eyes unfocused like dolls waiting to be played with. And then, one of them moved. Chris's copy took a single, shuddering step forward, and suddenly, its head snapped up, locking eyes with me. My breath hitched, an instinctive, primal fear flooding my system. Then, without warning, it lunged. The motion was unnatural, too fast, too fluid, like it wasn't bound by bones or muscle. I scrambled back just as it crashed to the ground where I had been standing a second earlier, its fingers digging into the flesh-like floor, leaving deep, bleeding grooves. A horrific, gurgling sound escaped its throat, something between a laugh and a dying breath. The others were moving now too, their heads twisting, bodies jerking forward as they began to chase us. Jessica screamed, grabbing Chris by the arm and yanking him upright as I swung my flashlight wildly, searching for an exit. There had to be a way out. There had to be. And then, I saw it. A single trapdoor, half hidden in the shadows, the wood rotted and cracked but still intact. It was our only chance. I grabbed Jessica's wrist and ran, dragging her and Chris toward it as the things behind us screamed, their voices overlapping, becoming a single distorted howl that made my vision blur. My fingers fumbled with the latch, sweat and blood making my grip slippery, my pulse hammering against my skull. The door wouldn't budge. It was stuck. It was too late. And then, just before the hands could reach us, just before I felt cold, rotting fingers curl around my throat, the trapdoor gave way. We fell. Again. But this time, I wasn't sure if we were falling out of the house, or deeper into it. We fell through the trapdoor, spiraling into a darkness so deep it felt endless, the air rushing past my ears like a deafening whisper from something unseen, something ancient. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, pain searing up my spine as I landed hard on a cold, uneven surface. My vision swam, black spots dancing across my eyes as I tried to push myself upright. Jessica groaned somewhere close, her voice weak, dazed. Chris wasn't making a sound. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around us like a second skin. Then, a sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Not knocking. Not scratching. Tapping. Like fingers drumming against wood. I forced myself to turn toward the noise, my breath caught in my throat as the flashlight flickered weakly in my shaking hand, its dim glow barely illuminating the space around us. We weren't outside. We weren't even in a basement. We were in a room that should not exist. The walls were lined with hundreds of frames, old and rotting, the glass cracked but intact. And inside each one, us. Photographs, still images capturing every moment we had lived inside this house. There was Chris, staring into the mirror on the second floor. Jessica, frozen in terror at the sight of her own reflection. Mark, before he had vanished, his head tilted at that impossible, inhuman angle. Every second of our nightmare, framed and preserved like a collection. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched one of the frames, the glass cold beneath my fingertips. And then, the photograph moved. Jessica screamed. The images inside the frame shifted, changed, played like silent recordings. In my own frame, I watched myself stand exactly where I was now, frozen in horror. But the figure behind me wasn't real. It wasn't there in reality. But in the photograph, it was standing right behind me. A shape, tall and skeletal, its arms too long, its face blurred, featureless except for the wide, stretched smile carved into the empty space where its mouth should be. My stomach twisted violently, dread clawing up my throat as I turned, expecting to see it, but there was nothing there. Just air. Just shadows. But I knew better. Chris finally stirred, groaning as he forced himself up, his breath shaky, uneven. "We need to get out of here," he rasped, voice raw with terror. Jessica was already backing away, her wide eyes locked onto the moving frames, the shifting reflections, the impossible moments caught inside glass. My fingers found the edge of a frame and, without thinking, I yanked it from the wall. The glass shattered instantly, the frame disintegrating like dust in my hands. And then, the world around us cracked. The walls splintered, the photographs burning away in an instant, the room shaking violently like it was about to collapse. A deafening roar echoed from every direction at once, not a sound, but a presence, something furious, something awake. The darkness surged toward us, consuming everything in its path. And then, I woke up outside. Sunlight. Fresh air. The house was gone. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. Gone. Jessica lay beside me, eyes fluttering open, her expression mirroring my own disbelief. Chris gasped awake, coughing violently, gripping the grass beneath him like he couldn't believe it was real. We were alive. But we hadn't escaped. I knew it the second I checked my camera, my fingers trembling as I played the footage. Nothing. Just static. No proof of what had happened. No evidence of the nightmare we had survived. And then, just as I was about to shut it off, one final frame appeared. A single, frozen image. The house. Standing exactly where it had been, untouched. And in one of the upstairs windows, staring down at me with that too-wide grin, Mark. The challenge was over. But as I lay in bed that night, exhausted but unable to sleep, a sound echoed through my room. A slow, deliberate knock. From inside the walls. And then, a voice. Whispering my name. I never left.